I had most of the bare bones of this video already written out, but when I began to investigate the criticism of Hirsi, I realized the rabbit hole went down much further than I'd anticipated. So I'm going to buck template and start with the criticisms. Ayaan Hirsi, born Ayaan Hirsi Magan, is a well-known and outspoken critic of Islam. I've seen her referred to as the dark-skinned Ann Coulter. I think that was meant as an insult, but your mileage may vary. She has served in the Dutch Parliament, has penned several books, and spearheaded a movie exposing some of the less savory practices of Islam with Theo van Gogh, who, incidentally, was later horribly murdered in the street. She's also a liar. I'm going to just put that out there with no diminishing. She's admitted to lying in order to secure refugee status in the Netherlands. She also took monies her husband had given her so she could join him in Canada, and instead used it to travel to Europe and seek asylum there. This posed some ethical questions for me, as I personally rail against the recent migrant entry to Canada that Dimples McPothead has authorized. Not overwhelmingly due to cultural concerns, but more that Canada is in a desperate financial situation, and I believe in putting out the fires at home first. Ironically enough, that comes from the best piece of advice I've ever gotten in my life regarding politics, which was from an imam. He told me, hold fast to your own culture. And so I do. But before anyone is shocked and horrified that I don't want to help these legitimately suffering people, I just want to remind y'all that this is a culture defined by tribal infighting. The Hashemites can't stand the Palestinians, the Pashtuns hate the Persians, the Dari hate the Pashtuns,
and everybody hates the Jews.
Muslim culture is not known for helping those who don't share bloodlines, so it makes me laugh and laugh and laugh that so many want that help themselves now. Religion of peace? On your bike. Anyway, I'm aware of the slippery slope argument that could say, well, Hirsi is different because she's doing something I like. Nope. In intellectual honesty, in the current situation here in Canada, I have to fall on the side of turning her, and others like her, away. Otherwise, I'm cherry-picking. However, I feel the need to point out that she has been forthcoming that she lied. This is in stark contrast to what we're used to here in North America, where often when someone in the media is caught lying, they will double down on the lie. I don't suffer from the belief that all persons who have arguments worth listening to must be paragons of virtue. This might stem from the rather colorful history of some of Canada's most influential politicians being drunks, philanderers, crazy people, and mystic wooers. I'm willing to let a lot slide if the net effect is in line with what I consider the overall good. And a lot of that is based on empirical evidence of the overall good. So with the checkered parts out of the way, and I'll link to an in-depth investigation in the low bar, I'm going to move on to the parts of Ayaan Hirsi that you are probably more familiar with. A brave and articulate critic of Islamic culture from the perspective of someone who lived it. Frankly, were I in her position, I would have lied my ass off to better my opportunities. In terms of platform and freedom, not merely in terms of money or fucking dental care, as well. Hirsi Magan, her original name, was born in Somalia, just at the edge of the worst the Barre regime had to offer. Her own father was jailed under that regime, and so she was raised primarily by her mother and grandmother. In her book Infidel, she writes clearly and eloquently on the realities of gender biases, tribalism, and religious fervor of the Islamic world. While her mother and father were relatively progressive, her grandmother was not. And the scene describing how she, her younger sister, and her older brother were held down against their parents' wishes, and their genitals crudely mutilated, is one that I personally will never forget. She then traveled through Saudi Arabia, Kenya, Ethiopia, and ended up in the Netherlands, having secured asylum seeker status, and parlayed her experiences into being a bit of a celebrity. She was sought after for interviews, and still is for her clarity and boldness. I first read Infidel a few years ago, and I read it again last week to prepare for this video. I had originally read it in a feminist context, And there are many, many things in that book that could fall under why we need feminism. Reading it now, however, and this is how this ties into the SJW Rehab theme, I still see the horrors to women, but I also now see the horrors to men. This is something I think often gets overlooked in the critique of Islam. The injustice to women is quite clear to a Western eye, but it isn't a picnic for the men either. Homosexual men are killed. Men suffer from vitriol attacks too, and a big thank you to Dan Perrins on Twitter for pointing me in an investigative direction on this. Men are jailed for opposing tyranny, as in Hirsi Ali's own father. There's an incredibly interesting passage in the book, to me, in how it was the women who browbeat their husbands into reviving the old ways of Islam by calling them weaklings and cowards and infidels. So the slide into barbaric, regressive, and despotic practices, while often pinned on those fucking muzzy men, is missing a huge part of the picture. Women still have power, even when they appear to have no power. That is gynocentrism. Two passages illustrate this well from Infidel on the radicalization brought by a ma'alim named Bakol Som. Quote, "But in time, Bakol Som acquired a large following. Most of them were women, and among them was my mother. They turned their living rooms over to Quran study, filling them with women listening eagerly to his sermons on tape or even to Bakol Som in person, with an opaque curtain separating him from the women, just as the Prophet had ordained." Quote, and, quote, "As Bakol Som's following grew, his sermons caused a lot of quarrels between spouses. At first, the Somali fathers and husbands were amused and teased their wives, predicting that after a week the silly, bored women would find some other pastime. After a while, however, irritations arose, and after their wives converted to the true Islam of the Muslim Brotherhood believers, they began saying that chewing cat, smoking, and skipping prayers were forbidden. They actually sent their husbands off, calling them unbelievers. When the men shouted about disobedience, the women replied that in the hierarchy of submission, we must follow Allah even before husband and father. Allah and the Prophet decreed that wives should obey only husbands who themselves obey Allah." End quote. And this brings us to hardening up, both externally and internally. When you begin to crack open the SJW narrative, you will be met by insult and irrational opposition, perhaps even doxing or swatting, or people attempting to get you fired from your job. They might even succeed, at least for a little while. This is annoying at best and can threaten your livelihood and personal safety at worst. And this is in our remotely civilized Western culture. So consider Theo Van Gogh. I'm going to read again from Infidel. Quote, "One November morning in 2004, Theo Van Gogh got up to go to work at his film production company in Amsterdam. He took out his old black bicycle and headed down a main road. Waiting in a doorway was a Moroccan man with a handgun and 2 butcher knives. As Theo cycled down the Linnéestraat, Mohammed Bouyeri approached. He pulled out his gun and shot Theo several times. Theo fell off his bike and lurched across the road, then collapsed. Bouyeri followed. Theo begged, 'Can't we talk about this?' But Bouyeri shot him 4 more times. Then he took out one of his butcher knives and sawed into Theo's throat. With the other knife, he stabbed a 5-page letter onto Theo's chest. The letter was addressed to me." This murder occurred 2 months after Hirsi Ali and Van Gogh had made the short film Submission, which brought into focus how abuse of women in Islam is justified by the perpetrators, quote, "in the name of God," citing the Quran verses now written on the bodies of the women. These women stand for hundreds of thousands of Muslim women around the world. End quote. So they made a movie, and he was killed. Like the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists. Like the Bangladeshi editor of the LGBT magazine. Like Corporal Nathan Cirillo. Like Zainab Giti and Sahar Shafaya. And Rona Amir Mohammed, who were murdered in Kingston, Ontario in 2009 for committing the crime of westernization by their patriarch and his most recent wife. Their own father and mother and husband. The women were locked into a car, pushed into a lock, and so they drowned. Slowly. And so, honor killings come to small-town Ontario. Despite our current Prime Minister's insane jellyfishing around the use of the word barbaric being used in the then Conservative government-published guide for immigrants that read, and by this post it has now been repealed, quote, Canada's openness and generosity do not extend to barbaric cultural practices that tolerate spousal abuse, honor killings, female genital mutilation, forced marriage, or other gender-based violence, end quote. Because we can't apply barbaric to these practices. That's racist, even if it's fucking accurate. And this is why we need to harden up. This also applies the other way, however, because it's very easy to condemn Muslims with a wide swath, but they are not all one hive mind, no matter how it can look that way in the media. There are other Muslim reformers, like Hirsi Ali, who are quietly working against the parts of Islam that are so destructive. Kurdish Muslims are not the same as Pashtun Muslims, so it's also important to harden yourself to the tendency to lump them all in the same category as bad or evil. Hardening up means considering ideas like Gynocentrism and anti-Islamist thought that you have most likely been taught are unacceptable if you want to continue to claim being a good, forward-thinking person. It feels dirty to consider the possibility that women are given special treatment and power, when here in North America there is a never-ending parade of flashing neon signs about patriarchy and how women are so downtrodden. It is equally like nails on a chalkboard, at first, to dip a toe into the murky depths of condemning horrific actions done in Allah's name. Because aren't we whites supposed to help those poor brown people? I mean, we have all this privilege. It can be a tremendously admirable thing to extend charity and compassion to others when their well-being lies outside of your own interests. Right up until you're slitting your own throat to do it. The first step is realizing that not everyone cares about your opinion, as Stephen Crowder so eloquently stated in his bit addressing the UMass hecklers. The second is ditching the fucking Pollyanna glasses and recognizing that not everyone cares about human rights the way you do. And by giving them a pass, no matter how good your intentions are, you are contributing to the very violence and human rights violations you think you are combating. Stop trying to be a good person. It's chasing the dragon anyway, as everyone has a different idea of what being a good person means. You will never ever achieve it absolutely. It's impossible. Harden yourself to these external moral judgments about what you believe. Give up trying to please anyone but yourself. Focus on ethics, reason, and facts. And know that even though ditching the virtue signaling is going to get you some hate, go Team Shitlord! You are still highly unlikely to ever have a 5-page letter stabbed into your chest for the crime of making a movie. At least there's that. And when you allow yourself the freedom to consider neutrally, you will uncover useful truths that polemicists on both sides do not disclose. But if you don't even allow yourself that freedom to even consider these things as possible, how can you form a fact-based opinion? How can a reporter doing an interview with Tommy Robinson on Islam, a reporter who has already formed an opinion, admit that she has never read the Quran her fucking self? Well, the same way that women's hospitals can capitalize on concern about female mental health, while refusing to acknowledge that the group at highest risk for suicide is men. It's all fucking self-interested bullshit. When you've been in the mindset that any criticism of something immediately means you must be an advocate of its opposite, like you point out gynocentrism, so you must hate women, or you point out the negative aspects of Islam, so you must be racist, it's hard to come to a reasonable middle ground. But it's worth making the effort. I'm going to finish with a clip of Ayaan Hirsi Ali speaking at the Sydney Opera House. I hope it inspires you the same way it inspires me. And thank you for listening.
Okay, now, I mean, you know, you've left and you turned your back on Islam in a very dramatic and public way, and you've paid a price because you travel with security guards and your life is constantly under threat, and you have to be, the way you live has changed very much. But when you write, as you did in Nomad on page 201, Islam is not just a belief, it is a way of life, a violent way of life. Islam is imbued with violence and it encourages violence. Now, those words must carry with them responsibility for the offence that they cause. Do you accept that responsibility?
Those words are a description of how Islam is being put into practice today. I make a very clear distinction in the book between Islam as a theology, as a philosophy on the one hand, and Muslims as adherents. And Muslims as adherents are very diverse. You will find a group of Muslims who identify themselves as Muslim in name only. You will find a group of Muslims who follow only the religious dimension. They pray, fast, etc., are not interested in the politics or the social dimension, that is Sharia, regarding the relationship between men and women. You will find Baha'is who have invented a prophet after Muhammad. You will find Sufis who are interested more in the pleasures of life, etc. So there's a great deal of diversity among Muslims. Islamic theology and what it preaches, the concept of jihad, Sharia as a legal system, not questioning the teachings of Muhammad, and the Quran being only a book that you follow and submit to, the rules that are in there. That is the difference. So that is what I am criticizing. And again, I come into Australia. There is a debate about immigration. I look up the number of refugees, displaced peoples, asylum seekers. I find that in the world, there are 40 million people who are fleeing, 40 million in total. Mm-hmm. And they are Christians and Muslims and whatever. 70% of that 40 are Muslim. Mm. When I talk about violence, that's what I'm referring to. And if you look at what is going on in these countries...
When you say when you're referring to violence...
Well, if you are only 1/5, you compose 1/5 of the world population, but you're responsible for more than 2/3 of the violence in the entire world. And most of that violence is propagated in the name of Islamic theology. And Allah is invoked throughout, Muhammad is invoked throughout. You hear jihad, then there comes a time when we have to stop being politically correct, and especially those of us who are born into Islam come out and say, there is something wrong with the moral system that we grow up with. Some of it is valuable and we ought to keep it, such as hospitality and charity and being nice to your parents. But the other parts, let's not be politically correct about it. And people like you, like the Catholics, what we can learn from you. Now, please let me finish this. What we can learn from you is that those centuries of critical thinking. You know, you Westerners, you take your money to third world countries, you want to be nice, you want to develop. We don't want your money, keep it in your pockets. Share with us your values. And the most important value that I have found in the West the last 18 years is the value of critical thinking. Question authority, whether it's the Quran, whether it's Muhammad, whether it's the Pope, or whether it is, you know, whoever is in charge of this concept building, the Sydney concept building, or the president, or the prime minister. That's what I learned about.
Okay, then let's talk about your solution. Let's talk about because you talk about the principles of enlightenment as being a possible solution to an antidote to the violence of Islam that you have taken exception to. In fact, that we all take exception to, it has to be said. How do you spread the Enlightenment to how many billion Muslims are there in the world? And living in remote places where ignorance and poverty continue to be problems? How do you spread that solution?
First of all, before you start spreading it, you have to change your premise. You have to start with the premise that those 1.57 billion Muslims, 1/5 of the world population, are fellow human beings, are endowed with reason. And that if you were to question their presumptions and their prejudices and their convictions, as individuals, they'll be open to it. Now, don't go to the remotest place in the world, wherever that is that Muslims live. Start with the Muslims living next door. We know in Australia itself that immigrants from Muslim countries, when you add them up today, form probably the largest group. You don't have to go to some remote place in Afghanistan or Somalia. You can start with the Muslim next door. And the way to do it is when the agents of radical Islam, who are financed by countries, Wahhabi countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait, come here and set up schools and Muslim centers and institutions where they can indoctrinate, they target Muslim minorities and they can indoctrinate them with the most radical versions of Islam. Instead of seeking to go to remote places, start with them and start challenging them and deny them those institutions and those centers and give them, again, that most important of values, which is critical thinking.
But invariably what happens, I can certainly say in the case of Australia, and in particular in Sydney, there was an instance not very long ago when there was an attempt to open an Islamic school in the western suburbs of Sydney. And there was a division between those who were very, very vocally opposed to the opening of the school because they didn't want those Muslims living amongst us and proselytising amongst us, and those who were very, very, I suppose you would call it politically correct, who were quite libertarian about it and who wanted to protect the sanctity and the ability of these people to actually practice their own faith and teach their own faith in that setting. Mm-hmm. So political correctness is an issue, isn't it? And that would stop people from approaching their next-door neighbour and wanting to have a discussion and pose alternate questions, because that's disrespectful.
It's disrespectful to deny people to pray. It's disrespectful to deny people to do something very individual, something that they say I derive pleasure from, that doesn't harm other people. But to establish an institution where you take young children who come mostly from poor countries, and Muslims come mostly from poor countries, and you indoctrinate those young children between the ages of 5 to 18 with ideas such as distance yourself from the infidels. That's the society that they're supposed to integrate into. You indoctrinate young women to believe that they ought to submit to men and to mystify their sexuality, that they can only be son factories, child factories. You indoctrinate young men to give up their lives for jihad or holy war. You teach them to be victims forever because they are taught to believe that as Muslims they are under siege. To discuss that openly and to deny the agents of that intolerant narrative an institution where they can take poor children and indoctrinate them with this nonsense, that is not respect. That is not being disrespectful. That is to say, no, we take these individuals first and foremost as fellow human beings, as Australians, and we are going to teach them what it is to be successful and loyal to the Australian society. And you agents of radical Islam, if you want to live under Sharia law, go to Saudi Arabia, go to Iran, go to some place where Sharia law applies, but you're not going to do it here.